Good evening, everyone. I'm the storyteller, here to help you fall asleep with these chilling horror stories. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and like the video. I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is, so feel free to leave a comment. When you're ready, get comfortable and relax. It all started. My friend Lara was a junior majoring in psychology at a prestigious college nestled in a quaint university town deep in the rugged forests of the Pacific Northwest. She had chosen this place deliberately for its serene campus, its picturesque, almost village-like surroundings, and the rich tapestry of local folklore that permeated the region. The town, a typical college community, was reached by winding country roads. Two main routes leading in and out, one from the north and the other from the south. I drove from my hometown, which lay about an 8-hour journey away, on an extended weekend to see her. But that weekend the sky had darkened early, and an unrelenting storm had set in. Normally I'd approach from the north, but this time, roughly 80 miles before reaching Lara's town, I encountered a police roadblock. Officers informed me that heavy rains had washed away a section of the highway, and for safety reasons they had closed that stretch entirely. Faced with two choices, a cumbersome detour back that would take nearly 7.5 hours or an approximately 4-hour detour via the southern route, I hesitated. Regardless of the path, the storm raged on with merciless fury, as if nature itself had seized control. After a moment's thought, I opted for the southern detour. I knew that a small side road would eventually merge back onto the highway. However, in this remote part of the forest, toppled pines and ancient oaks, defiantly standing against the relentless rain, had nearly erased any trace of the familiar path. My headlights barely reached 3 feet ahead, and the scant light that seeped through the lowered window revealed only the wet, misty silhouettes of the trees. Then, quite suddenly, I noticed something peculiar. The entrance I spied looked nothing like the country road I'd left behind. Instead of the usual roadside markers, I found myself enveloped by densely packed ancient trees, whose gnarled branches darkened the sky. Hanging on the right side of the road was a single, weathered wooden sign. In faded, hand-carved letters it read, "Welcome to Harvest Valley." The details, such as the town's population and its old motto, had been deliberately obscured, as if someone were trying to erase its identity. With my cell signal as poor as the meager beam from my headlights and the GPS barely able to pinpoint my location, I nonetheless felt that this had to be the correct turn. A sinking feeling took over as I steered onto the now perfectly straight road. It lay before me like an eerily precise runway, stretching straight into darkness without a single curve. As I drove, the darkness seemed to thicken even though the torrential rain began to subside. Overhead, an ancient canopy of pines and oaks spread out, as though the trees themselves were trying to hold back impending doom. Thunder rumbled briefly, shaking my car, and lightning flashed across the sky in sudden bursts, only to vanish as quickly as it had appeared. The further I advanced along this remote path, the more the road transformed into a symbolic threshold, a gateway to something that did not seem of this world. After about 10 minutes of slow progress, the rain abruptly stopped. I assumed that the mighty treetops had held back the downpour, and I drove to the very end of the road, to the entrance of something utterly unfamiliar. Right beside me stood an old, dilapidated sign, crudely carved with the words, "Welcome to Harvest Valley." All accompanying details, the population and the town's motto, had been carefully obscured. I rolled down my window to get a better look. Behind me, dense canopies of trees towered, while below, the asphalt had sunk into a deep black. The night sky was clear, and scattered stars twinkled faintly. The storm that had raged moments before now seemed miraculously spent. A deep sense of dread seized me, and instinctively I executed a sharp maneuver to turn back, planning to postpone my visit to Lara for at least another weekend. But scarcely had I driven 100 feet in reverse when the road inexplicably forked into 3 separate directions. Panic gripped me. Just moments earlier, I hadn't even noticed an intersection. It made no sense at all. With trembling hands, I decided to continue straight, telling myself I must have missed the side roads. Yet, after another 100 feet, I encountered a second intersection where 5 identical branches diverged in different directions, all flanked by rows of symmetrically planted trees. I was certain I would have noticed such a junction. Fatigue and the lingering stress of the long drive made me doubt my senses. I pressed on, and after another 100 feet, my eyes locked onto a familiar sign. Once again, as if emerging from nowhere, the old wooden sign proclaiming Harvest Valley stood before me. I watched in disbelief as the sign behind me seemed to vanish. It was impossible to circle back on a perfectly straight course. I hadn't even touched the steering wheel, merely accelerated. And yet, here I was, back at the same spot. Panic and unease swelled within me, so I shifted into reverse in a desperate attempt to choose a different path at the intersection. But the alternative route remained hidden, as if by a ghostly hand. Suddenly, I slammed on the brakes, and the red glow of my car's taillights illuminated the faded sign one more time. Harvest Valley, population. Hesitantly, I turned the car around, though my headlights continued to cast such a feeble glow that they seemed unable to penetrate the impenetrable darkness, even though neither rain nor fog obstructed the road. Barely 6 meters ahead, the path split once again. A right-hand turn opened up while the main road transformed into an area resembling a deserted courtyard. A forlorn yard or abandoned square that evoked a bygone era. Uneasily, I checked my cell phone. The signal was weak, but the GPS insisted I was still near the highway, close to the fork I had already taken. With no other choice, I took the right-hand path, hoping to skirt around the mysterious town and find an exit on the other side. I had read old legends about abandoned settlements, places that mysteriously vanished from maps after natural disasters or secret rituals, but I had never imagined encountering such a place in person. Everything about this locale felt both surreal and unnerving. Before long, in the darkness, small, almost ghostly buildings emerged. Old timber-framed houses, tiny shops, and dilapidated stone and wood homes that looked as if they had sprung directly from the 19th century or even earlier. My headlights caught sight of an abandoned schoolhouse, followed by an old town hall whose entrance was adorned with a bizarre stone crescent moon, flanked by carved figures of dancing children. A relic from a long-forgotten pagan era, rumored to be connected to secret occult rites. I drove on and passed a dilapidated farmhouse that exuded such eerie silence as if it were guarding a grim secret. Then, without warning, something flickered in my headlights. 4 rows of taillights appeared in the distance. They belonged to a pickup truck, a minivan, a station wagon, and a large RV. All the vehicles looked modern and well-maintained, a stark contrast to the ancient surroundings in which they were parked. I pulled over next to the pickup, which seemed abandoned. Curiosity got the better of me, so I stepped out to inspect the other vehicles. To my shock, I realized I was standing on the edge of a steep cliff. The vehicles were parked at a small overlook, from which I could hear the deafening crash of waves colliding with the rocks far below. As I circled around the minivan and the station wagon, I noticed they too were empty. Then, examining the RV, I saw its license plate bore an unusual combination of letters. RTR'd. The other vehicles sported plates from New York, California, and Texas. Bizarre yet unmistakable clues pointing to their varied origins. Suddenly, a soft orange glow began to illuminate the front of the RV. As I glanced around, a gradual shift in color emerged on the horizon, breaking through the darkness. The pitch-black night yielded to a vast expanse of water unfolding before my eyes. Not the typical lake one might expect in these parts, but an enormous, almost oceanic body of water. The orange light slowly deepened into a blood-red hue as its source climbed above the waterline. It was the full moon, bloody red and ominously full, entirely unlike the silvery orb I was used to. It gradually bathed the entire area in a ghostly red light. Simultaneously, a sinister ancient chant crept into my ears, a sound reminiscent of long-forgotten occult rituals and forbidden cults. Legends whispered through generations in these very woods. The crimson glow revealed that the main road led to a row of dilapidated old houses, their weathered facades evoking memories of bygone eras. Dozens of these structures lined the road until it opened into an expansive cornfield, and beyond that, the residents began to emerge. About 200 people, all draped in long white robes as if remnants of old harvest festivals or pagan rites, assembled in an eerie formation and began a ghostly chant. Several robust men wielded long staffs topped with sharply curved blades. In front of a wooden scaffold that looked like the entrance to an ancient cult site, they huddled together. High on the scaffold, arranged in a star-like formation, hung 10 individuals, naked, bound, and chained about a foot above the ground. Their desperate screams, barely intelligible behind tattered rags, filled the cold night air. The ominous chanting of the crowd grew louder. Then the men with the blades began to strike the bound victims repeatedly, advancing in strict formation. Shoulder to shoulder, they stepped onto the wooden structure and began to dismember the captives, their arms, legs, torsos, and chests slashed until the scaffold was drenched in a fountain of blood. Soon, it was the turn of the townspeople. One by one, they passed through the scaffold, their white robes and pale faces splattered with crimson stains. A horrifying thought dawned on me. These 10 bloodied bodies had to be the victims linked in some way to the vehicles I had inspected earlier. After the blade wielders set aside their weapons, as if fulfilling a grim duty, they stepped onto the open field and stood motionless, their eyes fixed on the blood-red moon. Suddenly, the air grew heavier, as though it were part of some ancient, somber ritual. One after another, the burly men spread their arms, and they began to levitate slightly above the ground, not more than a foot, but enough to give the impression of weightlessness. The blood-red moon, now filling the entire sky, revealed its cratered surface in eerie clarity as a resonant, heart-wrenching rumble emanated from it. Everyone present, townspeople and cultists alike, seemed to hover in a grotesque choreography, as if the moon itself had cast them under its spell. Then, a piercing scream shattered the ominous silence. A young girl, barely a teenager, stood at the edge of the overlook, her wide eyes fixed on the ghostly scene, first glancing at the abandoned vehicles, then locking onto me. In an instant, every gaze in the assembly turned to me. The robust men raised their long, blood-soaked, curved blades once more, brandishing them in a menacing manner. Behind them, the reddish glow of the full moon gradually receded, and dark shadows fell once again over Harvest Valley. Panic surged through me. I bolted back to my car as enraged shouts and horrifying screams erupted behind me. It was as if the townspeople, driven by ancient rituals and blind fanaticism, had singled me out for their vengeful wrath. I started the engine and sped down the narrow side road with all the power I could muster. The town now lay shrouded in near total darkness as the blood-red full moon slowly descended toward the horizon. All around, furious shouts echoed as I suddenly noticed that throngs of townspeople had blocked the road, dozens standing across my path. I didn't stop. With one final desperate burst, I floored the accelerator and barreled head-on into the charging mob. The windshield of my car shattered under the violent impact as cold, greedy hands clutched at the vehicle. The townspeople swarmed wildly around my car. I first felt the front left tire burst, then the right, as the blade-wielding men systematically attacked them. Even the rear right tire finally gave way. I couldn't go on. Too many attackers blocked my way. In a desperate bid to escape, I shifted into reverse and backed up, ramming several of them with my car. A sharp, evasive maneuver even sent the last two clinging to my vehicle flying off. All I could think was to return to the overlook. Maybe one of the abandoned vehicles held a key that would allow me to flee. But at the speed I was traveling, there was hardly time to search. I could only guess and hope. Suddenly, curved blades slammed through the shattered side window, grazing dangerously close to my chin. One assailant had scaled onto the car roof. I jerked the steering wheel in a futile attempt to shake him off, but a tire was barely holding on. The attacker drew his blade once more and swung. It nearly clipped my ear. Before long, I found myself nearing the overlook again. In my rearview mirror, the taillights of the other vehicles shone brightly. In about 50 meters distance, it seemed as if the entire cursed town was pursuing me with furious intensity. I had no time to consider jumping into another vehicle. There was only one way out. So I floored the accelerator. Just as a townsman swung his blade down once more, my car went over the edge of a precipice. The final red glimmers of the blood-red moon faded as my car plunged into the dark abyss. I watched as the icy water surged upward, and I took a deep, steadying breath. The car struck the water's surface with brutal force. I felt the windshield shatter loudly against my forehead as frigid water rushed into the cabin. With every ounce of strength, I unbuckled my seatbelt and forced my way through the shattered window. The headlights, now pointing downward, revealed a ghostly wreckage on the lake's floor. Dozens, even hundreds, of abandoned vehicles lying as if they had met their end in a storm decades ago. I fought my way to the surface. Massive waves pounded my body as I gasped for air. After a brief moment to catch my breath, I saw one of the townspeople, who had shared in the crash, hurtled mercilessly against the rocks. His head had been split open, and he resembled a tattered marionette. A colossal wave then hurled me against a flat rock along the shore. My ribs exploded with pain. They felt as though they were shattered, yet strangely nothing seemed to be actually broken. I landed on another flat stone and found myself in a narrow, sheltered gorge that barely protected me from the raging waves. This tight passage led down the mountainside, and summoning every ounce of courage, I crawled onward. Slowly, the blood-red glow of the full moon slipped behind the horizon, and the tumultuous waves began to subside. But no sooner had the abyss calmed than the storm returned in full force. Thunder rumbled, lightning streaked across the sky once more, and rain lashed down relentlessly upon me. Unbowed, I continued crawling until I discovered a narrow path winding for miles along the edge of the vast, almost ocean-like lake. A slender trail that finally offered a glimmer of escape. Gradually, the storm abated, and on the distant horizon a new light emerged. It was the sun. Never before had I felt such indescribable relief as I beheld its dazzling light. Before me, the rocky slopes opened up into a small, sunlit beach. With my remaining strength, I fought my way ashore, and soon discovered a paved road nearby. I couldn't tell whether I had returned to the familiar highways of the night before, or if these were ordinary, well-traveled roads, until suddenly, headlights reappeared on the horizon. A state police cruiser, its patrol having begun only about an hour after the storm, pulled over. The officer reported damages and described chaotic conditions. I found myself at a loss for words, unable to explain that on that storm-driven night, I had encountered an occult, moon-worshipping cult in a town that wasn't even listed in any official records. So, I told him that I had become separated from my car and lost in the storm. He took me to the nearest police station, where I filed an accident report and a missing vehicle report, even though, deep down, I knew my car would probably never be found. Eventually, a federal officer handed me over at a nearby bus station, and thus I began the long, arduous journey back home. It wasn't until later, when I tried calling Lara to recount the unbelievable events, that I realized I could scarcely find the words. Even now, I remain silent about that night. Driven by curiosity, I began researching the mysterious community of Harvest Valley. But to my horror, I found no official record of its existence. No entry in any registry, no mention on any old map, as if the place had never existed. A few old newspaper clippings from the 1980s mentioned missing travelers and enigmatic rituals in an abandoned settlement, but all evidence of it had long since vanished with time. A week after my return, I contacted my uncle, who worked in law enforcement. I mentioned the striking license plate on the RV. It bore the mysterious inscription, Arturd, which I had mistakenly thought might hint at something significant. My uncle rifled through his records and later called me back, asking why I was so intrigued. I offered a flimsy explanation that once such a vehicle had blocked me on the highway. He simply remarked that it seemed as though those involved had finally received their just punishment, for every report indicated that the participants had mysteriously vanished over a week ago. I do not mourn the recent passing of my grandfather. Rather, I feel compelled to recount the way I knew him, because without him, I wouldn't be here today. It was as if some uncanny presence had sought me out when I was just 8 years old, and I know with absolute certainty that I wouldn't have survived if it weren't for my grandfather behind the wheel. On a late spring day, my grandfather and I set out on a fishing trip deep into the remote woods of West Virginia. My dad had planned to join us, but at the last minute something came up, so for the very first time, it was just the two of us. I always felt a bit intimidated in his presence. I'd only ever seen him surrounded by friends and family, laughing and talking. Even though I was too young to fully understand it then, I admired how he stood as an unwavering authority figure for my father, just as my father later became for me. As he patiently explained the different kinds of fish and demonstrated which bait worked best, I listened as if his every word were the most important thing in the world. Little did I know that this unshakable trust in his advice would one day save my life. Everything began in the most unremarkable way. After leaving our best fishing spot, we retraced our steps along narrow woodland trails lined with rugged, moss-covered rocks, heading back to the car. The rocky outcrops seemed to echo my grandfather's voice almost magically as he prepared to pack up the gear. While he carefully stowed the fishing equipment in the trunk, I had a few precious moments to myself and decided to wander a little. I returned to a spot where I had once heard my voice bounce back to me, and so I shouted as loud as I could. Strangely, my yell barely rebounded. The echo was faint, nearly non-existent. I screamed with all my might, but nothing answered. At 8 years old, I couldn't fathom how such a phenomenon was possible. I assumed I had simply shouted wrong, or perhaps that my grandfather's deep, mature voice produced a resonance that my childish shout could never match. Yet that peculiar silence haunted me, and on our drive home I finally mustered the courage to voice my doubt. Every detail of that moment is forever etched in my memory. It was exactly 3:22 p.m., as the dashboard clock confirmed. The sky was nearly cloudless, with only a few delicate wisps drifting by. Then, suddenly, my grandfather's eyes widened in alarm and his weathered hands clenched the steering wheel. "What did you say, kid?" he demanded in a sharp, almost merciless tone. I replied softly, "I was wondering why I didn't hear an echo like you do. I shouted, but nothing came back." Usually his face bore gentle, relaxed wrinkles, but at that moment his expression darkened and his brow furrowed with concern. Hastily, he scanned the surrounding greenery as if searching for something amiss. Finding nothing, he abruptly opened the glove compartment and produced a small bag of gummy bears, pressing it into my small hands without any warmth. For a fleeting moment, a smile tugged at my lips, but I immediately sensed that this was no affectionate treat. "Eat them all," he commanded in a gruff voice. The bag seemed to hold a veritable feast. Had I been allowed to choose, I might have savored them one by one instead of gobbling them all at once. "Why?" I asked timidly, uncertain of the reason behind his order. "Eat them all, kid," he repeated without mercy, and I instinctively began shoveling the sweet candies into my mouth. Not long after, he reached over to the cup holder and handed me a thermos filled with bitter, strong coffee. "Drink it, all of it," he ordered firmly. "But Mom said I wasn't supposed to drink coffee," I protested in a small voice. He wouldn't let me finish. "Your mom will understand. Drink up, kid. I know the coffee tastes awful, but you need the sugar and caffeine. This thing, this damn creature, wants to lull you to sleep. Don't let it." As he spoke, my gaze wandered out the car window to the passing landscape. The dense, dark forests of West Virginia, the gently rolling hills, and in the distance, the rugged outlines of ancient mountains. There, against the seemingly motionless range, I noticed a tiny speck, as if something were stirring. Then, suddenly, my grandfather placed a firm hand on my shoulder. "Drink up, kid, and eat the gummy bears. You need that sugar and caffeine, or that thing will put you to sleep." His tone was insistent, and the determination in his eyes made the blood in my veins run cold. As the bitter coffee slid down my throat and the sugary confections began their effect, I saw movement outside growing inexorably closer. I turned my head again toward the window. That tiny speck had grown into a vague figure, moving with an eerie, unnatural speed. I glanced at him in confusion. For a moment our eyes met, then he shifted his gaze back to the horizon. Drawing a deep breath, he fixed his determined look on the road ahead. With a force I had never seen before, he pressed the accelerator even harder. We were already cruising at a decent speed on the interstate, but now he was pushing the car to its very limits. Faster than anyone should ever drive. The mix of sugar, caffeine, and paralyzing fear began to surge through my small body. My cheeks and forehead grew warm, and my hands started to sweat. "What's happening? I'm scared," I stuttered, panic thick in my voice. "Be scared, kid," he murmured in a steady tone as the speedometer crept upward from 81 miles per hour to 90 miles per hour, then 100 miles per hour, and eventually over 120 miles per hour. "It keeps you awake. This thing, this cursed creature, it came for your grandma once, and it started just like this. Right before a long drive, we noticed that her echo went silent." His face twisted with anger as he added, "But cars today are much safer than they used to be. I won't let it hurt you." With every surge of acceleration, the seat pressed me more firmly against my back. As we passed that forbidden threshold, I looked out the window once more. The vague figure was now unmistakable. A shadowy silhouette of a man running parallel to us along the rolling hills, between dense stands of trees and scattered rocks. "There he is again," I whispered in disbelief. Angrily, my grandfather growled and slammed the gas pedal even harder. I clutched the armrest and the door handle desperately as our car hurtled down the seemingly endless interstate like an uncontrolled missile, racing mercilessly into the deepening twilight. It felt as though we were a bullet launched beyond all safety limits, and I trembled at the thought of another vehicle suddenly appearing on the road. Amidst the mounting panic and adrenaline rush, a strange, creeping drowsiness began to overtake me. My eyes grew heavy, and in a daze, I glanced to the right. On the gravel shoulder of the highway, beneath the dull glare of the afternoon sun, a black, humanoid silhouette emerged. A ghostly figure sprinting alongside our car with impossible speed. In that almost featureless darkness, I could discern tiny, glowing specks like stars scattered across a night sky, even though the sun still hung in the heavens. I watched as the blurry feet of the figure pounded over the dashed center line of the road. A deep, lethargic drowsiness seized me while the figure running parallel to us inched ever closer. "Wake up!" my grandfather shouted as he, now driving around 110 miles per hour, released one hand from the wheel to tap my shoulder forcefully. "It's trying to suck the life right out of you. Wake up!" He jerked the car into the left lane, and though I was pinned tightly into my seat by the force, I couldn't tear my eyes away from the hypnotic pattern of the dashed lines. One by one, between the white stripes, dark, ghostly feet seemed to appear, moving in perfect sync with our speed, and one of them stretched out an arm as if to pry open our car door. I remember the car shaking violently, as if I were witnessing the launch of a space shuttle where astronauts are ripped from their seats. Even though I now know we were pushing the vehicle to its absolute limit, in that terrifying moment the world seemed to freeze, trapped in a macabre dance of dashed lines, sparkling lights, and spectral limbs reaching out from the darkness, desperate to breach our sanctuary. The wind roared past us like a raging hurricane as we soared beyond 120 miles per hour. Half asleep and panicked, I cried out while my grandfather veered the car as far left as possible without leaving the road. But nothing could stop the horror. The ghostly figure, its blurred hand reaching out with a faint, starry glow, held our door open against the howling wind, preparing to leap inside. The other hand reached out with an icy grip toward my neck, and an indescribable chill, like the cold contempt of an alien cosmos, washed over me. Yet the creature was never fully here. It seemed as if it could only interact with us in fleeting moments. At least, that's what I believe now. In the instant when the car shuddered violently, the speedometer needle surged into the red, and that spectral hand reached for me time and again. An overwhelming, paralyzing drowsiness overtook me. Finally, with a deafening crash, the car door slammed shut, cutting off the raging wind. With every passing second, we distanced ourselves from that presence. It raced alongside us in anger, but always remained just a fraction too slow. In the blink of an eye, it appeared to realize that it could not catch up. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished. Days later, I awoke in a hospital room. Naturally, my grandfather never revealed the true story to anyone, and the doctors offered a simple explanation. A massive loss of electrolytes and salt, triggered by an extreme imbalance, had plunged me into a coma. But I knew the truth. Since that day, I've shared a small but vital piece of advice that my grandfather once gave me, even though his words might sound illogical at first. If your echo falls silent, cancel your road trip. It's waiting for you. It's out there, in the vast open landscapes of America, in the dark forests and along endless highways. And it has probably always been here, unnoticed, until we began driving faster and faster. Every day, people die because they fall asleep at the wheel, and I'm convinced that not all of these tragedies are mere coincidences. So, heed the warning. If your echo falls silent, cancel your road trip. It's waiting for you. Ever since I was a kid growing up in Pine Hollow, Tennessee, I always sensed that something was off about our little town. In Pine Hollow, generations of folks clung to old, unwritten rules handed down by our grandparents. Rules that, to us, were as real as the humid summer nights. They'd say things like, never leave your front porch light off on a stormy evening, never tap your boots on the wooden steps, for fear of disturbing the spirits, and never, ever let the stew pot run dry on a cold night, lest misfortune come knocking. But among all these superstitions, there was one rule so strictly observed it sent shivers down everyone's spine. Under no circumstances was anyone allowed to drive down the old county road after sundown. This twisting, narrow stretch of asphalt once served as a vital link between Pine Hollow and Nashville, about 30 miles away, and during daylight hours it bustled with the commuters and truckers alike. Many of the experienced drivers, including my father, would take the road in the late afternoon when the traffic thinned. Yet, as soon as dusk fell, the road was left completely deserted. My father, who'd sooner bunk down in his truck than risk the dark drive home, never made the return trip after nightfall. I remember one summer evening when I was still a wide-eyed kid. Unable to quell my curiosity any longer, I asked my dad, "Dad, why don't you just turn on your headlights?" He stared at me for what felt like an eternity, then said in a hushed, measured tone, "Because there aren't any streetlights on that stretch, Luke, and it's far too dangerous after dark." There was something in his eyes, something unspoken, as if he were guarding a secret too terrible to explain. I pressed on, "But Dad, even with headlights, why can't you drive that road?" He shook his head slowly and replied, "Even with light, it's too risky. One day, when you're behind the wheel, you'll understand why that road is cursed." While I was learning to respect those warnings, my older brother Daniel, who'd soon earn his driver's license and inherit our old '67 Ford Mustang, became the very antithesis of caution. Ever since he was a teenager, Daniel had been a thrill-seeker, gleefully defying the taboo of driving on the cursed county road at night. Our father would often catch him sneaking out in the dead of night, racing along that deserted highway with a devil-may-care grin. When Daniel started dating a girl from Nashville named Cassie, his midnight escapades only grew bolder. Our father's warnings became even sterner, telling us never to call him for help if Daniel ever found himself in a jam. Daniel was absolutely enamored with the rush of those night drives. He would boast about how liberating and electrifying it felt to speed down the empty road under a starless sky, and he tried several times to rope me into joining him. I always declined, even though, deep down, I envied the freedom and audacity he exuded. One humid evening, Daniel announced that he'd be picking up Cassie after her shift at 7 p.m. My mother, ever the guardian of proper behavior and safety, chided him, "Daniel, it'd be a lot better if you brought her home during the day. Nights on that road are dangerous." With a dismissive wave, he shot back, "Don't worry, Mom. Cassie's staying over tonight." My mother mumbled something about it not being proper for a night like this, but Daniel just grinned confidently as he hopped into his Mustang and sped off, tires squealing against the asphalt as the last of the sunlight faded away. That very night, everything seemed normal until bedtime. In the quiet darkness of our modest home, I could just make out the hushed, urgent whispers of my parents in the hallway. I lay awake, straining to hear the familiar rumble of Daniel's car, or even catch a glimpse of Cassie through a crack in the door. Suddenly, the shrill ring of our telephone shattered the silence. In Pine Hollow back then, not every home had its own phone, so we'd often borrow Mr. Carter's landline, the only connection we had to the outside world. Barely had the ringing died down when heavy knocks rattled our front door. Mr. Carter was there calling out for my father, but even though my dad was normally a light sleeper, I didn't hear him rise. In that instant, I knew what was happening. Mr. Carter's visit was the silent signal that Daniel was in trouble. After a few moments, the knocking ceased, and I heard Mr. Carter's measured footsteps retreat into the night. Before long, I heard a voice from outside my window. "Luke, Daniel's Mustang is down on the hill. Come quick." There was no time to waste. I scrambled out of bed and joined Mr. Carter, who was waiting by his silver Chevrolet Nova. Without a second thought, I climbed into the car and we sped away from the comforting glow of our streetlights into a world swallowed by darkness. The landscape outside was unrecognizable under a thick, impenetrable fog that rolled in like a black shroud. All the familiar landmarks of Pine Hollow were obliterated by the night. Mr. Carter drove steadily, his focus absolute, and I couldn't help but notice that his headlights remained off. "Mr. Carter, why aren't you using your headlights?" I asked, my voice trembling with worry as we navigated the treacherous curves of the county road. In a low, gravelly tone, he replied, "The headlights would only attract them, Luke. The old spirits that some say haunt this road are sensitive to artificial light." I dared not ask him who them might be, and so we pressed onward into the darkness. Every twist and turn made my heart pound as if the car might skid off the edge at any moment. Then, through the murky gloom, I caught sight of two flickering amber lights in the distance. Mr. Carter slammed on the brakes. "Look, Luke!" I shouted, pointing toward a figure in the distance. There, off to the side of the road, was the Mustang, its hazard lights flashing wildly, casting erratic beams into the black void. "I see it," Mr. Carter murmured, "but there's no one at the wheel." My stomach dropped as we drew nearer. Daniel was nowhere to be seen. Instead, slumped in the passenger seat was Cassie, her body trembling, her eyes wide with shock, yet miraculously uninjured. For a long moment she sat frozen as if in a trance. Then Mr. Carter lowered the window and called out sharply, "Ma'am, are you all right?" When she didn't immediately respond, he honked the horn repeatedly until she finally turned her head. In the weak glow of the car's dashboard, I could barely make out her face, but the cold, searching look in her eyes sent a chill straight to my core. In a near whisper, she managed to ask, "Are you here to help?" "Where's Daniel?" Mr. Carter demanded, his tone edged with urgency. With a shaking hand, Cassie pointed toward the impenetrable darkness of the road ahead. "Luke, stay here with Cassie," Mr. Carter ordered firmly. "I'm going to go look for Daniel on foot." "Wait, Mr. Carter," I protested, fumbling with my seatbelt as I prepared to follow him, but he was already gone, disappearing into the night. Left alone in the car, I found a small comfort in the fact that Daniel, in his habitual carelessness, had left the keys in the ignition. The engine continued to hum softly, and the dashboard cast a weak, reassuring light. Yet, a deep dread had settled over me, made even more oppressive by Cassie's silent, haunted presence. As I tried to steady my racing thoughts, I heard Cassie murmur, almost inaudibly, "Luke, do you see it back there, behind your car?" A sudden icy shiver ran down my spine. She had called me by name. How could she possibly know? Reluctantly, I turned toward the rear window. At first, there was only endless darkness. Then, in a sudden burst, the Mustang's hazard lights flared, and for a fleeting moment I saw something stretching across the road. "What the hell?" I thought, heart hammering in disbelief. The lights flickered once more, and this time I clearly made out 6 ghostly figures standing in a straight line, slowly advancing toward us. My breath caught in my throat as each flash of light rendered the figures more distinct, their pale outlines seeming to emerge from a time long forgotten. In that terrifying, suspended moment, a sharp knock rattled the driver's door. "Luke, open the door, please." Without a moment's hesitation, I pressed the door release button. In that instant, as if by magic, the spectral figures dissolved into the darkness as though they had never existed. With trembling hands and a heart pounding in terror, I opened the door wide. Mr. Carter then stepped in and, with a weary sigh, carefully pushed Daniel's limp form into the back seat. "Is he going to be all right?" I managed to stammer, barely able to keep my voice steady as fear gripped me. "He'll live," Mr. Carter replied in a flat, matter-of-fact tone. "But whatever did this, they've played a cruel trick on him. We need to leave the car here. Tell your folks to meet me here first thing in the morning, and I'll come back for the Mustang." Bewildered, I asked, "What do you mean, Mr. Carter?" He sighed heavily before beginning in a subdued, almost sorrowful tone. "A long time ago, this road was part of the old Route 41 that connected Pine Hollow to Nashville. Back then, countless trucks and buses traveled this stretch, and with its treacherous curves, accidents were all too common. One fateful night, a tour bus carrying a group of high school students on a field trip lost control in a particularly dangerous bend. In a desperate bid to save himself, the driver leapt from the bus, and the vehicle plunged into a deep ravine. Every one of those kids was presumed dead. The ravine was too steep, too inaccessible to recover them. The bus was never found, and legend has it that the souls of those who perished still wander this road, waiting to be noticed. I whispered, "That's unimaginable," as a chill froze my blood. Lowering his voice further, Mr. Carter asked, "Luke, did you see them?" How many?" I managed to stutter. "6, he replied softly, "though I believe you counted one less. It hit me like a freight train. One is missing." "No," he murmured, his eyes fixed in the rearview mirror. "The girl." I instinctively reached to glance back at the rear seat to check on Daniel again, but a firm hand on my arm held me in place. "Luke, don't look," Mr. Carter whispered, his eyes reflecting a terror I'd never seen before. With a dry mouth and trembling limbs, I sank back into my seat, unable to meet the horror outside. Suddenly, the car lurched violently, as if something heavy were shifting in the back. In a small, uncertain voice, I asked, "What are we going to do?" "They won't hurt us," Mr. Carter replied, though his voice trembled with barely concealed fear. Then he began to murmur softly, almost like a prayer, as the car jerked violently from side to side. It felt as if the little Chevrolet Nova had suddenly grown unbearably heavy, and I was certain that Daniel's slender form couldn't be the cause. Then, from somewhere behind us, a low, mocking laugh echoed in the darkness, and just as abruptly, the lurching stopped. Without a moment's hesitation, Mr. Carter slammed his foot down on the accelerator, and the Nova roared up the steep hill as if fleeing an unseen menace. Had it not been for his impeccable driving, I'm convinced we would have tumbled into a ravine. It wasn't until the first faint lights of Pine Hollow shimmered in the distance that our frantic ride finally began to slow. When Mr. Carter pulled up in front of our house, my father was already waiting at the door, his expression stern with worry and relief. The two men exchanged a silent, knowing glance. After my father thanked Mr. Carter for his assistance, he hoisted Daniel effortlessly from the car and carried him inside. The next morning, only after Daniel had fully come around, did I learn what had happened. All he could recall was that the engine had suddenly died when he stepped out to pop the hood. He couldn't remember calling for help, and it soon became clear that on that forsaken road, there was simply no way to get a signal. As for Cassie, word had it that she'd taken ill that very night, and never actually managed to meet up with Daniel again. Strangely, ever since that dreadful incident, Daniel had steered clear of the old county road. But recently, with a new modern highway built to bypass that accursed stretch entirely, he suddenly suggested that we take another night drive together. I was so astonished by his proposal that I agreed without a second thought. Yet, as soon as I sat in the passenger seat, memories of that fateful night surged back, and I couldn't help but wonder what had spurred Daniel's renewed enthusiasm. "Hey, Daniel," I asked tentatively as the car merged onto the modern highway, "after all this time, why do you want to drive at night again?" He offered a wistful smile and replied, "I've never stopped loving night drives, but over the years I've been tormented by the same recurring nightmare. It's as if every time I pass that old road, I'm forced into the role of that doomed bus driver. I'm speeding, overtaking another car, and suddenly I have to leap from the vehicle to save myself, or I'm doomed to plunge into a bottomless chasm, and then come the screams. The screams at the end. They're unbearable, and they always wake me up drenched in sweat." With every word, his smile faded, and deep down I knew that the ghosts of that cursed road still clung to him. A trauma so profound that it could drive even the bravest soul to madness. And so the memory of that horrific night in Pine Hollow lives on, a grim legend passed down from one generation to the next. Whether it was nothing more than superstition or an inexplicable phenomenon that unfolded on that lonely, eerie road, the truth remains shrouded in mystery. And as I sit here, I can't help but wonder if those restless spirits are still out there, waiting for the next traveler to cross their path.